Good afternoon and welcome to the afternoon plenary session of Day 2 of the 33rd Aged and Community Services Australia National Summit. We've got back-to-back panel discussions this afternoon, first on human rights and aged care and then on workforce strategies. Our human rights discussion is brought to you by Summit sponsor Alaya Care. First, before I introduce our speakers, a little bit of context. The Aged Care Royal Commission identified significant human rights issues in Australia's aged care system, things like the overuse of restrictive practices, including the use of physical and pharmacological restraints. And the Commission singled this out as one of 4 concerns requiring immediate attention. The Commission also noted that there's no clear statement in the Aged Care Act of providers' basic responsibility to ensure that care is safe and of high quality, and it called this a major gap in legislation. So it's not surprising that the Commission's very first recommendation is that a new act should come into force no later than July 1, 2023, and that this new act should, among other things, provide a system of aged care based on a universal right to high quality, safe and timely support and care. It should assist older people to live an active, self-determined and meaningful life. It should protect and advance the rights of older people receiving care and to be free from mistreatment and neglect, harm and poor quality or unsafe care. And it should enable them to continue to enjoy the rights of social participation accessible to members of society generally, and enable them to exercise choice and control in planning and the planning and delivery of their care. And the Commission's second recommendation went to this too. It also called for the new Act to specify a list of rights of people seeking and receiving aged care and declare that this is a purpose of the Act. Securing those rights is a purpose of the Act. In short, we can say that the very top of the Royal Commission's list of recommendations is a call for a human rights-based Aged Care Act. Now, we've gathered together 4 speakers who've been deeply engaged with human rights issues in aged care for many years to help us delve into what that means. Our speakers are happy to respond to your questions, so please do use the Q&A section to the right of your screen to post any questions you have. I'll do my best to put them to the panel, although I've got plenty of questions of my own. So let me introduce our panellists briefly. You'll find their full biographical details on the Summit website. Dr. Sarah Russell is Principal Researcher at Research Matters and Director of Aged Care Matters and co-founder of Aged Care Reform Now. You'll probably know Sarah from the 62 opinion pieces she's written in the last 5 years, it might be 63 by now, and her regular media appearances discussing aged care issues. Originally trained as a critical care nurse, Sarah became interested in aged care when her parents moved into a residential home. And as she cared for them, she cast a critical eye over what she saw around her and became a critical aged care researcher. Her work has now been commissioned by government ministers and published in peer-reviewed journals. Ian Yates, AM, will be familiar to you as well. Ian is CEO of COTA, Council of the Ageing Australia, the national peak consumer body for older Australians, and Ian's a member of the Aged Care Financing Authority, the Aged Care Quality and Safety Advisory Council, the Aged Care Sector Committee, and many more bodies indeed. Craig Gear is CEO of OPAN, the Older Persons Advocacy Network, and a healthcare consultant with more than 20 years senior management experience. Craig also has a background in nursing and he's been on a number of health sector boards, including chairing Senior Rights Service New South Wales. And Daniella Greenwood is an international consultant, speaker and author who specialises in human rights policy and practice in residential aged care, particularly as it relates to people living in the later stages of dementia. Daniella's worked in a range of roles in residential care, from personal carer to national strategy and innovation manager. She's presented her work to federal MPs at international conferences and indeed to the Royal Commission. And she's regularly engaged in a range of expert advisory roles. Daniella is also a member of Reimagining Dementia, a creative coalition for justice. Welcome to you all. Sarah, I'm going to start with you. In your very first op-ed, I think it was, on aged care in The Guardian back in 2016, you wrote that if the government really values the safety of older people, it would rewrite the Aged Care Act from scratch. So you must be well pleased by the Royal Commission's recommendations. And without wanting to dwell on the past, why do we need a new act?
Oh, look, we need a new act for a lot of reasons. The Aged Care Act was written in 1997 when we were in a very different position. Back then, John Howard recognised how much money was going to need to be spent to provide adequate care for older people. And the Act was actually written to encourage private investment in aged care. And I became very concerned that aged care was operating within a free market, or potentially a free market. And I felt frail older people should not be cared for within a free market. I didn't think it was appropriate. I thought the Act had so many problems that it actually needed to be rewritten from scratch. My biggest concern back in 2016 was regarding staffing. The Aged Care Act, 1997 Aged Care Act, did not stipulate staffing. It actually says an adequate number of suitably qualified people. Now, what does that mean? Well, every provider interprets that however they like. It wasn't actually stipulated. I went back this morning, just to read the Hansard from 1997, just to see what people were saying about what this new Act would mean for older people. And Senator Gibbs said exactly what has happened, and that is that staffing levels would be, and staffing skills would be reduced. And we have seen that. We have seen over the last 20 years the staffing has been replaced from registered nurses. We now have more personal care attendants. And exactly what she predicted would happen has happened. And that's why we need a new Aged Care Act.
Thank you, Sarah. And look, we'll come back to that question of staffing levels and ratios and whether the 200 minutes recommendation in the Royal Commission is going to solve that problem. But Ian, I want to come back to you. As Sarah said, the existing Aged Care Act came into force almost 25 years ago. Is part of the issue here that the world has simply changed around the old Act?
Yeah, in part, that's true, Peter. I am been around long enough to remember before the Act. And I indeed remember when the very notion that there would be such a thing as residents' rights was raised back in the Hawke government, and there were reports into that, which led to the creation of what we now know as OPAN and its members, but the initial residential care advocacy services. And I have to say, as someone who was then running CODA South Australia, it was interesting to me in terms of culture, and I'll come to where culture fits in a minute, that it was not unusual for me. And we had two advocates in South Australia. It was not unusual for me to get calls from CEOs of aged care providers asking me to get these advocates to back off. The notion that they would have some role in relationship to his or her residents, mostly they were his, was alien. So going to the 1997 Act, the fact that it's about the relationship between government and providers and funding of the system is something we can critique now. Back then, that wasn't surprising. That actually is predominantly the history of aged care policy, for better or worse, both before and for many years after that. I used to say, until I got to learn how you banged the table or you used the media so that they couldn't ignore you, that when you got together about aged care policy, governments and providers had a bit of a barney at one end of the table, and every now and then they'd notice that there were consumers at the other end. There were some good things in the 1997 Act. The notion that you would have external standards, the notion you'd have an accreditation agency. There were poor providers who left as a result of that. But those things were, if you like, subsidiary legislation. And one of the challenges that we have going forward, and looking how this new act is constructed, is going to be quite critical. One of the challenges we have going forward is how you interpret standards. So I would say that new standard number one, that every resident is treated with respect and dignity, would, if applied in the way that we see it, that the people that we talk to all the time, both in residential care and home care with lived experience, would see it. And if they were able to give their voice, it would wipe out half the industry at least in terms of practice. And I do mean things like physical and chemical restraint. But I also mean things like, why is it that aged care has frequently been unable to get it, that not all old people want to eat off of a similar menu at the same time every day, and so on, that these things are not treating people with dignity and respect. And it's interesting to me to note that people coming into the industry from other industries, like hospitality, have got that in a way that people in the industry for a long time haven't.
Well,
The point, just to round off, the point about this is what's changed is through all the choice and control stuff, the consumer-directed care debacle, but then subsequent choice and control, we are now clear that the industry needs to be focused around the customer, the older person. That's where it needs to be focused, not around the provider or the government.
So just and I'm going to come to Craig in a sec, but just if you can clarify there, because I'm familiar with that. I've been around long enough too to be familiar with that terminology, consumer-directed care. But now the language is around choice and control or consumer-centred care. Now you're saying this is more than semantics.
Oh, yes. Consumer-directed care was a good idea, although it was a wimp out from the then Labor government in terms of the recommendations of the Productivity Commission, which we, and indeed officially the sector supported, which was to put funding in the hands of consumers. It really didn't. And because there was no real enforcement, most of the providers that were going to do it did it, and the providers that didn't. And that culture, I remember Ken Wyatt telling me that he was visiting a provider and asked them how they were going with consumer-directed care, and they said, "Oh, we don't do that here. That's just a silly idea they had in Canberra. We know what's best for our people." So the culture hasn't shifted. It has in many providers, but it hasn't. We haven't had the enforcement mechanisms, and that's what the Act, we have to work really closely with the drafting of to get it. But it is a significant shift. It is turning the orientation of the system around.
Thanks, Ian. So, Craig, to you, for a long time we've had a Charter of Aged Care Rights. A charter was updated and simplified as recently as 2019. Why hasn't that charter been enough?
The charter does work quite well and alongside the aged care standards, the quality standards. I suppose it's the reflecting from the older person's perspective of what they can expect from the provider. But the problem is, I think a lot of times people don't listen to it. People don't respect the charter, and people don't uphold or really understand it to the effect of what it actually means day to day. The other thing about the charter is, while it is there under the quality of care principles, it does sit way down under principles rather than something that has teeth, that is enforceable, that older people themselves are educated in, and older people will be able to work with providers, and the aged care workforce understands this charter and that it needs to be enforceable. So the missing piece of this is it hasn't been right up front in the legislation, and that's why I suppose if we can get an Aged Care Act that enshrines human rights in legislation at the start of the Act, it starts to go some way to providing, I suppose, the levers and mechanisms for which then older people can say, I see myself here, I see myself and I see how you will treat, respect myself and my family member. When you don't do that, there will be consequences. And I don't think we've had that to date. It's been a piece of paper, and it's been something that you might get a copy of if you're lucky. You might see a poster on the wall if it happens to be there, like it is behind me here, but you would be lucky to see if there was anything that actually happened if one of those rights were breached. If someone has the right to make decisions about their own life, like they have their whole life, and those decisions may include some level of risk, then the provider must do that. The aged care worker must allow that to happen. That hasn't occurred to date.
Thanks, Craig. Daniella, I can imagine providers who are attending the summit will have some concerns about how a Human Rights Act might work. Human Rights-Based Act might work in aged care, how choice and control will work in practice, particularly for people suffering serious cognitive challenges as a result of dementia. Is there a tension there?
I think there's always been a tension with seeing people with a whole range of disabilities as having the same human rights as everybody else. And I think I agree with what everybody has said, particularly around the idea that the culture is not one that is based in human rights, really. I think for people, the first thing that has to happen is really an ideological shift in the industry, and there's no way you can have human rights and profess to have a human rights approach unless you've dealt with the very foundations of what we do. And that takes a bit of self-reflection on behalf of the industry itself in terms of, I know in all my jobs in aged care, I've secretly heard myself say with colleagues, one day we're going to look back in this and think, oh my gosh, I can't believe we did that. Today is that day, and a human rights lens is what makes those tiny, tiny moments that everyone's spoken about here today in terms of life, particularly in residential aged care, it really makes these very normalised people stripping away of human rights to do with what Craig said in terms of just everyone thinking they've got a right to make decisions for older people that they know better. The first thing we need to get to is the foundations of what we do in aged care comes from a medical model. And I think that we can't escape going back to that old argument again, but clarifying within that a human rights approach codifies, especially in particular treaties like the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, codifies excellent clinical care, equal access to excellent medical professionals, which we don't have at the moment. And it's certainly not of the same quality as other citizens would expect, particularly not for people living with dementia. So when I say moving away from a medical model, it's that idea, that eugenics idea really, that old age and frailty and vulnerability and disabilities, including the disabilities that come with dementia, are something other than humans. So those other humans can't have the same rights. It's been so normalised in day-to-day practice and even codified that these people have different rights than other citizens. That's why we can have practice in aged care where it's so normalised. I mean, we're talking about the big ticket items like restraint and abuse, but this comes from somewhere. It comes from the idea that, yes, once we change the Act, that will be really important, but it won't do everything. It's really important because if it's not there, that says a lot too, especially to aged care providers and aged care workers. When they come in and aged care providers talk to the daughter and say, let's do that assessment for mum, or just assume that someone else will be at the table, whether people have dementia or not. This is older people as a category, really, moving into residential aged care. It's just subtly assumed that everyone will have a say, that everyone will be kept up to date. And we can talk about staff training to try and fix that. Staff training won't fix that. It's the people watching this panel. It's people in policy and those people who are heading up organisations. It's that level that needs to stop and stop kind of turning screws down below and talk about staff training and more audits and start thinking about, wait a minute, people with dementia and older people have human rights, the same human rights as everybody else. Health is just one human right. We need to look at this all again through a full human rights lens, not just a health lens.
So I'm going to channel the providers to some degree as much as I can at the moment and just ask all of you to respond to this. So I'm imagining I'm a provider and I actually feel that I take the human rights of residents or the people who I provide care to in their home very seriously. But, you know, I'm dealing with someone who doesn't speak English or has lost the capacity to speak English and reverted to their original language. So they need an interpreter or a bilingual carer. I'm going to Ian's point about, people wanting to eat meals at different times, or perhaps, have a shower and get up at different times and all those sorts of things. Absolutely understandable. I want to do all that. But how do I do that when I'm under intense cost and time pressures? I mean, that's going to be my dilemma, I can imagine, as an aged care provider. Yes, I absolutely agree. Human rights, number one, essential. And I've only got so many staff and they've only got so many hours in the day. So any of you would like to respond to that? Sarah?
I'm going to jump in quickly. Sarah's on mute, sorry. Look, I think one of the things I reflected on is when Daniella came and spoke to our Building Human Rights into Aged Care Symposium, and she showed a video there about a nurse, and that nurse was effectively me in my previous career. Someone coming in and going, come on, up you get, this sort of thing, and thinking, and I would have done that, and I would have thought that I was doing the right thing because this person really needed a shower. This person wanted to lie in, they wanted to have a sleep in, like I do, pretty much every day. So that while yes, there has to be more staff, and we need the minutes to increase, and we need the quality and the training of staff to improve. However, it is in the little things about how you treat and respect. And if you were thinking that you were that person in the bed, how would you like to be treated? Those sorts of things don't cost more money. They might cost you stopping, pausing and thinking, but we all have a role in it.
Oh, Craig, I can hear you completely there. And when I worked with staff to develop those tiny films, staff at Mercy Health actually, we used theatre to bring out these little scenarios where human rights are casually breached. It was never about staff practice. Yeah. Obviously, that was what was where it ended up. But the trick was to step back from that and everything that weighed down on that moment. And it was, as Ian said, they just didn't have flexible breakfast. I really don't go for that argument around, well, this is going to cost more. We just need to stop that. We're not invading a foreign country. They do it in Qantas Club. We need flexible meals, not staggered ones. We need food that's available all day, okay? That's just, don't be in the industry anymore if you can't do that. Bring in, as Ian said, experts from outside who know how to do this in all sorts of avenues, and we can keep people safe. So the idea that without flexible breakfast, that's probably what happened to you. You knew that there was a 40-minute window for you to get them there. Plus, you were trained under that medical model. That paternalism that you know better is a legacy of the medical model. It's not your fault. It's not these staff fault. It's the whole system that's actually supported them to think and work that way. In their own homes, they'd tiptoe around the room if they got up before one of their family members. They're not monsters. They've come into a system that is so normalised that I worry that we just chuck staff training at the hat and victim blame them further without the people in the higher up in the organisation actually doing the work required to change the policies, to get creative. They may need to fire some of their head managers in different departments. We need creative people who can come up with flexibility and make sure that human rights on the most basic level, it's embarrassing we even have to talk about that, but we do need to codify some of those operational shifts because we can't leave it up to industry to do that because it's failed.
Sarah? I just want to make a very quick point about Craig's example, and this happened quite recently where an elderly woman did want to sleep in and the staff member allowed that. So at 11 o'clock when her daughter came in to visit, she was still in her dressing gown, as she had requested to be, wanted to lie in, wanted to just, watch some telly in the morning. So the daughter came in when she was in her dressing gown at 11 a.m. watching television, and the daughter made a complaint that her mother hadn't been showered, wasn't dressed, and was furious. And there was no communication. I mean, I sorted that one out in a second. It just was a matter of communicating. But so there are...
That's a matter of the daughter not being given a fence around what she can and cannot get involved in, particularly with frontline staff. She can't go up to a staff member and say, why isn't my mum up? Because that staff member should never be put in that position. That's a problem of the organisation, not to clarify from day one that the older people who move in have a right to privacy, have a right to do whatever they want without sanction from family or medical professionals, and that we won't be answering questions like that from family. That needs to be stipulated from the moment people move in.
I'm in full agreement with you, Daniella, agreement. But I'm just letting you know, though, that the complexities around some of this is not just around providers, it's not just around culture, it's around everybody involved in that, a resident's life.
Ian?
Same point.
And I agree with that, but I'll make 2 points. I mean, what we would say is that these things are symptoms of embedded ageism in our society that also meets the medical model. And everybody in our society, with very rare exceptions, has inculcated some degrees of ageism because it is so fundamental, and you have to unlearn some of it. But Peter, I just want to say 2 things, I think. One is, as I've been saying for years, but particularly repeatedly during the Royal Commission, and indeed during COVID, that some of this is difficult, but I'm not setting the bar. There are providers who now are setting the bar. So we had a provider come speak at one of our conferences and who brought in consultants to say, what do these new standards mean for our organisation and our approach and our culture? And in the end, they decided that it meant they had to turn themselves inside out and that they've had to unlearn what they'd done and relearn by putting the consumer at the centre. And I gave an example earlier about mealtimes, and I talked to a fairly leading provider who's trying to deal with that. And they started by saying, well, it would be good if we could work out how to be more flexible and change things. Oh, that's a bit hard and that's a bit hard. And then a light bulb. Sorry to stream Greg Hunt, who talks about light bulb moments all the time. But a light bulb. Oh, what if we were to sit down with the residents and ask how they would like their day, their meal experience, their interaction structured, and work out how to do it. And after we've worked out how to do it, then we'll work out the transition. And there are providers who are doing these things, just as there are providers out there, to use a different example, who will not have much difficulty, if any, meeting the new minimum staffing minutes requirements because they're already nearly there, but a whole host of the industry isn't. So that the standards are being set in the industry, but the environment in which we exist, the regulatory environment, has protected too many poorer providers for too long. So my principle in all that is co-design. And co-design means you don't start with a solution and go consult on it. You start with how do you define the problem?
Craig, you're very big on... Go on, Sarah. Yeah.
On that note, one of the most exciting recommendations, in my view, in the Royal Commission, and which has been taken up by the government's response to the Royal Commission, is Commissioner Briggs recommended the Council of Elders.
Yes.
And the Council of Elders is going to inform the New Aged Care Act. Now, let me just say 2 things on that quickly, if I could. Co-design has become a buzzword in health, the health department, and I have not seen it done properly in the health department. I've been doing co-design work for 30 years, and it insults me that someone like KPMG might consider a brief chat with a couple of older people co-design. That is not co-design, and that is consultation, and very poor consultation, if I might say so, as I attended the most recent one on... That's irrelevant. If we are going to have a Council of Elders and we are going to have that inform the Aged Care Act, I'm begging that we do this properly.
Okay, so
I just wish we could call it something other than a Council of Elders. I'm sorry just to put that forward, but it kind of feeds into that all old people are wise and those other stereotypes that just feel a bit North American to me.
I agree. But nonetheless, I still think We've got to take what we can get sometimes, and we've got this. So let's make sure we make it work properly.
Craig, I know that you're big on the idea of co-design, but I want to put this to you. We have a timeline from the Royal Commission of a new Act by July 1, 2023. That's actually just over 2 years away from now. That's I would think, quite a short amount of time. Is there a risk that instead of co-design and a sort of thorough process of coming up with a new act, we end up with a kind of consultation, as Sarah put it, perhaps a few well-paid consultants coming in, and then a bit of a patch job on the existing.
Yeah. I mean, one of the exciting things of Sarah's work and what she's been doing around mobilising community is that older people are saying this themselves. They are online. They are in the streets. They are saying, we want our rights. We want our human rights enshrined in this act, in this legislation. And there is, I suppose, a concern that we have already where some of the language around human rights, Australia doesn't do well with human rights, I think, because we're not sort of that's kind of, like you said, that's a bit US, that's a bit over there. But the idea that my dignity will be respected, that I will be part of that, is something that older people have been saying for a very long time and need to be listened to here. The Council of Elders does need to have people with lived experience, diverse experiences. They need to be on panels like this. And the older persons reference group that I work with have been saying they're nothing about us without us mantra. And I think we do risk watering down. We still can enshrine rights and it not be that scary, because it'd be how we would want to be treated ourselves. So, yes, it's quick, but I think with the community mobilising behind this, with older people being able to speak for themselves because they can and they have been for their whole lives, let's get this done and we can bring ideas forward fairly quickly. Working with the Council of Elders, working with groups like Sarah's, we'll bring these things forward and forward quickly.
Look, I'm very aware that our discussion so far has been very much focused on residential aged care, sort of implicitly, but I think we should recognise that most care takes place in people's homes, and in particular that often that